All right, so I'm here to share with you my story, my professional story, hopefully inspire. I am the sole owner, the CEO, the CFO, the creative director, and the fashion designer of Nili Lotan, the company. Nili Lotan has right now, the company is about 20 employees. We have a wholesale business that sells to 250 high-end specialty stores, which the top of it is Barney's and Burger Goodman's, 2.5 retail stores, and an online store. Usually I start my story when I landed here in 1980, which is where I started my career. I studied in Chicago and moved right away, and my career took off here. But this time I thought I'll go a little further, and I'll take you back to Netanya, Israel. And if I want to think about what attributed to my success, which took right away, it was overnight success that took 30 years, started with my mom. My parents, my home, went through Israel. The drive and the spirit of the Israeli, growing up in Israel, my talents that I got from my parents, but I worked very hard for 30 years to develop them. My intuition that took me all along, and most importantly, my guts, my being brave. And the reason why I'm showing this picture, when I was 1 year older than what you're seeing here, and that's the reason why there's a double fence. I literally jumped out of the second floor, landed on the grass, came back home, said hi to my mom, and went to my room. And she looked at me, she was a little confused, and she said, weren't you just in your room? And I said, yes. And that's where I checked my boundaries and see how far I can go. And that's actually what I think one of the most important things that I took with me, besides the drive and the Israeli spirit to bring me where I am right now. I'm going to split, since we only have 10 minutes, I'm going to split my speech into two. One before I started my own business and one after. I had actually worked for 20-some years in one of the most successful companies in New York. I came straight from New York, straight from Israel, and worked for 4 companies. Adrian Vitalini, which you might not know, Liz Claiborne, Ralph Lauren, and Nautica. I spent about 6 years in every company, and clearly learned quite a lot for 20-some years in every company. If I have to say, what did I pick in every company to be ready to start my own? I always say that Adrian Vitalini, I took endurance because it was a very difficult to work environment, and I survived it. So I literally endured the 6 years at Adrian Vitalini. I traveled a lot. We traveled all over for manufacturing, for trends, for all over. I've been 4 times a year in Hong Kong, 3 times a year in Paris, 3 times a year in London, 3 times a year in Milan, going back and forth, working for 3 years. The second job that I had, I was actually literally met Liz Claiborne herself and her husband, where they offered me to start a brand new division for Liz Claiborne, which in 1 year became a $100 million business. At that point, I realized that I could contribute more than just design. I ran a company of 30 employees who sourced all over the world and created a brand that was a very successful brand for Liz Claiborne. After that, I moved to Ralph Lauren. I was a design director at Ralph Lauren, working on the men's line, and then moved to Nautica. And after all these, 2003, started in 1980, a very spontaneous move. I started my own business without any financial plans, just a very, very clear vision of how I see my business in terms of who is the customer that's going to buy my clothes and what market I'm targeting, the sensibility of my clothes, started my own business. I have, from the very beginning, a very clear aesthetic, and part of it I can definitely contribute to growing up in Israel, the fact that I have very much of a laid-back approach. Would I have grown up in the Upper East Side, it would be completely different. I have a very, one of the things that I'm reaching for in my clothes is self-expression and having your own style. I very much, when I talk about fashion, I try not to use the word fashion, and I'm talking about style. I really believe that I'm giving women the tools to create their own styles and express themselves. This is my store in Tribeca. Actually, I started the business with a wholesale business, as I mentioned, where I was selling to quite a lot, at this point, 250 stores. A few years later, I literally just passed by that store. I lived in Tribeca and decided that that would be my store. Turned it into, maybe you can show the side. It's a very interesting concept where you actually, at that point, could see through the windows how the clothes are being made. The atelier, the studio was downstairs, and upstairs is the retail store. The store was designed in the concept of a gallery where only one item of the same will hang in pretty much sporadical way. There's old books. It's kind of has the sense of an art gallery, the light, the books, the art. And it became a very unusual spot in Tribeca. One of the things that I've learned from that is that I like to be actually in neighborhoods rather in the shopping areas like Soho. I connect with the customers and I have constant feedback of what I'm selling, especially that I'm downstairs. A few years later, about a year ago, I opened another store in East Hampton. I realized that this is my customer right there. The store is designed the same way. Actually, an interesting thing is you can see it in the window. The way I display my clothes is on an old laundry machine that actually very slowly turns around. This is my studio. You can see throughout my aesthetic is very clean, very minimal. I try to keep very spare spaces. This is where I work. What I created, which I mentioned before, the atelier, which is a very unusual concept for New York these days, is my own atelier, which is back in the days of Yves Saint Laurent, and basically all the major companies right now, they send specifications overseas, and that's how great they close. I make everything in-house. We have 3 sewers, a pattern maker, a cutter. I make all the first collections in-house. 250 styles are being made here, and then after we show it in Fashion Week, we sell it, and then we manufacture. Most of the manufacturing actually is done in New York City, right between 34th Street and 42nd Street, between 7th and 9th. My very first collection, which takes me back to Israel, was 5 pieces, which, as I said before, now the collections are 250. It's a very unusual and very gutsy thing to do. It came from the idea that we design 250 garments, but at the end of the day, there's 5 pieces that drive the business. In any other business, it's the same thing. I figured I'm smart enough, and I've been doing this for 20 years to figure out the 5 pieces. So I basically showed 5 pieces. The 5 pieces were very much inspired by a military outfit that started with my ex-husband in the Air Force. I took his jumpsuit and kind of tore it apart and redesigned it. And the first jacket that you've seen was one of it. Coming out of the box, it was a big success. I mean, Barney's became my customer, and all the big high-end fashion stores. My logo, it's my ID from the Army, 2609988. It's my military ID. Just like the idea. All the concept of all the labels actually originated with military printed labels. I have variations of them, and in all of them, it's my personal ID. People tend to ask me quite a lot, what is that number, 260, and then when I tell them it's the Army, that starts the whole story about Israel. The military concepts actually go throughout my collection, and every collection I have a military jacket, a military pant. It's something that goes with me, you know, it's part of my aesthetic, it's part of my references from the past, in a good way, not in a militant way. These are some of my pieces, some of my collection that we can go through. As I said, I've done, it's going to be 10 years now, so there is quite a lot of collection to go through, but we'll go quick. It's very minimal, aesthetic. I do believe that the fact growing up in Israel and being influenced more by French fashion than being influenced by American fashion did create something in me that is very different than the norm here. 2 years ago, I started a sweater business. My very first job was a sweater at a sweater company, and I had started a sweater design for myself, and it's slowly taking over my company. It's just a big success. Another element that takes us back to Israel, 2007, we were in Lebanon, I was traveling with David, and I came back to New York and felt like I needed to express myself too. And I sat down with a designer and created this gun print. And Karolina Karkova is walking the streets with it. I kind of, after that, started to do a whole concept of expressing social issues on dresses. This is the separation wall in Jerusalem. It's a picture actually of Ziv Koren, who I bought the rights to use for that dress. And it goes on and on. I think prior to this, we've sent Bob Dylan when he turned 70. I also used him. You want to use it? Yeah, right there. So I kind of use the fabric as a canvas to express certain feelings, certain thoughts, to evoke thoughts, but this is a small portion of my collections. That's pretty much it. I mean, I guess the one thing that I can say is that once someone told me, I pretty much run by my intuition. I don't look outside in terms of, I inspire myself. And of course, I'm inspired by everything that I see. But once someone told me that intuition is a combination of intelligence and experience. And I guess that's what brought me where I am.